Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
Welcome back to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Executive Director William Wolfe, and I'm joined today by a very special guest, Megan Basham. Megan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Now, Megan, you and I have known each other for a couple of years. We got to speak on a NatCon panel, a few years back in fall of 2022, run into each other at a Liberty University
You got
event.
all the cheers, by the way.
That was a fun event, fun panel. And you are primarily a reporter for the Daily Wire. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. Culture reporter. Morning Wire is where you can particularly hear me a lot.
Okay. And so I think it'd be great for our listeners, because I think a lot of the people who will be listening to this know you for probably your Twitter presence, engaging on evangelical issues, which is incredibly important. I'm so thankful for the work that you do there, as are so many others. But I think a lot of people, they might not know your background in the reporting world. So if you would just tell us a little bit about your career that's brought you to this point so far.
Sure. So, I graduated with a degree in English Lit. And after that, my husband went into broadcast journalism right after we got married. And I wasn't sure if I was going to pursue journalism for sure, because he had to move a lot. If you're not familiar with broadcast journalism, you usually start in a small market and you move your way up. And it means moves every 2 to 3 years, very similar to the military. So I started freelancing for outlets like National Review, the Wall Street Journal, landed a book deal in 2008 with Penguin. At that time, it was just Random House. Now it's Penguin Random House, on how young women want to stay home and how they can do that by supporting their husbands' careers, which was really what I was invested in at that time. Did a journalism fellowship, the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship, and was really able to carve out a niche as a stay-at-home mom, where I was working some, but being able to work around my family's needs, which were the priority for me. And that brought me to World magazine for years and years and years. First as a freelancer, then had an official contract as film and entertainment editor, later as a co-host of their flagship podcast, The World and Everything in It. And so I just continued over the years to keep my hand in journalism. And as my kids got older, I got a little more aggressive. And then in 2020, really 2019, like a lot of people, I started noticing wokeness coming into the church. It was coming in not only to my own church, but to a little bit. I saw it at the Christian school my kids were at. I received a letter at the church we were at the time from our children's ministry director. Things like, how could we talk to our kids about their white privilege? And these things were really alarming to me. And I saw it a little bit at work too. Some people who were used to be my coworkers at World, who ultimately went on to mostly Christianity Today, also were really pushing CRT related topics very heavily. They were demanding that we change our reporting to accommodate this new racial consciousness, things like that. And it really pushed me in a way I never expected to do something different, because I was super comfortable in my little World magazine nest. And I was comfortable, not really being very out front in the world. And I was so troubled by what I saw. I did an interview with Andrew Klavan, and the vision he cast for what was happening at the Daily Wire, really trying to make a difference in these things. I just saw maybe an opportunity for me. And on a whim, I said, "Oh, do you guys think you might have any opening for me?" And it just sort of popped out of my mouth. And then they called me for an interview, and I panicked. I was like, I don't want to go somewhere new. I've been here so many years. I don't know that I want to do this. And it was really my husband who went, I don't know. I feel like maybe God's calling you to something new and something different. I don't know, babe. I think you should consider this. And so that's how I ended up at the Daily Wire, and how I ended up writing about all of these evangelical topics, because suddenly I didn't work for an evangelical institution and I could talk about them with a freedom that I did not have as much when I was, in the evangelical fishbowl.
Yeah, it's fascinating you put it like that. There is, I think, quite this culture inside of any evangelical institution that really kind of precludes criticism. There's no way to have an honest assessment of what's happening, whether it's inside the SBC, if you're in the SBC, or inside, evangelical publishing world, TGC, if you're a part of it, just because of the culture that it creates. And as soon as you criticize it or explore it or ask a question or push back, you're a bad guy, not with the program. So you got out of evangelicalism so you could turn around and put evangelicalism under a microscope, or really rather track evangelicalism through financial infiltration from progressive billionaires and leftists, which is what your book is about. And that's, of course, what we want to talk about more today, which is your book, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Pastors Traded the Gospel for Gender. Okay, I forgot the subtitle there. So now this book is getting a lot of attention. When is it finally out?
Yeah, hopefully it's not getting too much attention too early. So it's officially out on July 30th. So still a couple of months to go. But I think what I've seen is there is such an interest and such a demand for hard reporting on this subject that the interest has been almost overwhelming really early on. So I'm grateful to you and to others who, very much wanted to talk about it leading up to big events like the SBC convention. So people going, my phone's been ringing off the hook going, is there no way to get this out before the SBC convention? And I'm like, no, the publishing calendar won't fit that. But that just goes to show why there's such a need for this topic.
Right. And so the reason why so many people are interested in it coming out before the SBC annual meeting, which is in just, less than a week from now, by the time you're listening to this podcast, is because the book is so SBC heavy. Now, when you started this journey to do this investigation and write it, did you know that so much of what you would find would lead back to the Southern Baptist Convention, or was that a surprise and it's just how it turned out?
Yeah, very much just how it turned out. I am a member of an SBC church, but I did not set out to write a book about the SBC. And I don't think I entirely did, but it is very SBC heavy in some ways, because the SBC, one, is so large and so influential. By some accounting, it represents as much as 5% of the total U.S. population. So we're not talking about professing Christians or anything like that, or religious people even, but total U.S. population, 5%. So that's really big. So if you want to move evangelicals, it does make sense. If you're a left-wing organization or influencer, billionaire who wants to move evangelicals, of course, you're going to focus most of your firepower on the Southern Baptist Convention just by virtue of its size. So, I do go into obviously some other non-denominational churches, PCA matters, and some other denominations, but you can't get away from the elephant in the room, one, because of the SBC size, but also because the fact of the matter is it has been such a target to so many left-wing actors.
So, Megan, you saw some of this infiltration of progressive leaning beliefs and values into Christian organizations, like you've mentioned with World, but thankfully now World is standing strong under new leadership there. But you also then began pursuing and pulling on this larger thread of progressive infiltration into all of American evangelicalism as you researched and wrote this book. And perhaps one of the biggest threads you found brought you to the SBC. I've had a chance to read most of the book, not quite all of it, but I certainly searched for SBC, Russell Moore, J.D. Greer, some other very important terms of interest, and I found a lot of them. And in your chapters, a reoccurring presence is either the Southern Baptist Convention or the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, or some of our seminaries or major figures. Were you surprised by just how much of the SBC made it into Shepherds for Sale?
Yeah, I was a little surprised because even though I am a member of an SBC church, I didn't set out to focus on the SBC. And I didn't exclusively focus on the SBC. I do talk about non-denominational churches, the PCA, some other denominations, but the SBC does loom larger than I was expecting when I started out writing this book. And I think part of that is simply the size of the SBC. It is, by a lot of estimates, as much as 5% of the US population. So not, Christians, not religious people, but the entire population. So that's a really big chunk of Americans. And if you are some left-wing actor trying to move evangelicals, it makes sense that you would target the SBC first and especially. And that is really what I found when I started digging into the material. It wasn't like I was guessing, maybe a Soros-funded institution or think tank would be interested in the Southern Baptist Convention. They actually say in their documents, we're interested in influencing the Southern Baptist Convention. So there was really no getting away from it. And then, as all of these topics popped up, whatever the political topic may be, I just repeatedly found myself finding the same actors. There's my dog, if you can see him in that mirror. Yeah. He came to the voice. So, but they repeatedly kept popping up in all types of topics. And these leaders themselves, J.D. Greer, Danny Akin, Russell Moore, people like that have been so influential in evangelicalism that there was really no way to get away from them either.
Yeah. And, I listened to your interview with Tom Askell on Founders. It was excellent. Tom asked you, what surprised you? And you said three major names: Tim Keller, Russell Moore, J.D. Greer. When it comes to the SBC list, who else would you say makes it up there? Obviously, Tim Keller's not. I'm wondering, Rick Warren, was he another one?
Yeah, Rick Warren recurs quite a bit on a number of topics. And again, Danny Akin recurs on a number of topics. The Merritts, both Jonathan and his father James, pop up now and then. So really a lot of the leaders that you've seen in the SBC who are right now still kind of pushing what you might call the more, let's say, in the direction of liberalism. I know they would deny we are not pushing towards liberalism, but they are doing things like saying, hey, let's carve out an accommodation for, say, women pastors or something like that. So it's been really interesting to see those same guys still acting in these same ways. And it kind of makes me regret, gosh, I wish I'd have written a chapter on women pastors.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that debate's not going away, but, You mentioned that, they might not be trying to push us towards liberalism. I'm certainly thinking.
I said that's what they would say. I didn't say that's what I would say.
I'm sorry, what they would say. But what I think is so important about your book is, regardless of what they say, is that they're the actors, sort of they're the pawns being used by actors and organizations and dollars that explicitly say our goal is to co-opt and subvert these Christian and evangelical organizations. And so, you have this quote in the beginning there where you're talking about how secular billionaires are looking to sort of speak earnestly, if not openly, about how to take down what you call the fortress of evangelicalism. And you say that they say LGBTI organizations need to appropriate Christian values for a progressive rights agenda. And so your book talks about this shift from sort of an open confrontation from the progressive secular organizations and political actors to this subverting and co-opting approach in maybe the early 2000s. Could you talk some more about that? What brought that about, and what did that look like when they began to try to co-opt as opposed to attack?
Right. And that was something that I saw again and again with a number of foundations. That one that you just mentioned right there, that quote, that wasn't me. That was the Atlantic Philanthropies directly saying that, saying that this is what we have to do if we want to win. And you saw the same thing with another really large LGBTQ foundation, the Arcus Foundation, directly saying that we keep running into the same roadblock. And that roadblock is religious belief. They would say religious faiths, by which they mean the church, by which they mean Christians and evangelicals in particular. So you saw the same thing with a think tank called New America, which is Soros funded. also funded by a number of other left-wing actors, but very much a secular left foundation. They also said, in this particular case, we were really pushing for fossil fuel legislation, and they could not get over the hump. And they really started to say, how do we get around this resistance in the conservative base? And that's when they realized we are never going to get where we want to get unless we find a way to persuade evangelicals to come to our side rather than convince the rest of the populace that they need to oppose evangelicals, because they simply weren't finding success on that. And you see them, and I quote them very explicitly saying that we are failing because we can't get around these religious people. And in one particular case, I think they actually said, unless we do this, we will never find success on something like gay marriage. So they said this. And that was fascinating because they lost. I mean, what we have to remember is back in 2008, even in deep blue California, gay marriage was losing. So you had these foundations realizing that if we don't change our tactics, we are never going to see our policy preferences enacted.
Yeah. And so one of those change in their tactics was essentially to start giving money to conservative evangelical organizations. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
And so where, in terms of I've seen some of the funding, obviously, one of the things that, stuck out so much to me was how the ERLC, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, received a $50,000 grant from, and how do you say his name? Is it Omidyar?
Pierre Omidyar.
So Pierre Omidyar's organization gave the ERLC $50,000 for that MLK 50 conference. That wasn't something I was tracking. When those dots were connected to me, it was just staggering because so many conservative evangelicals look at that MLK 50 conference as sort of a watershed progressive outing in the evangelical world. And then you look, behind the scenes at the 990s and you realize, well, this was funded by a incredibly progressive leftist Buddhist billionaire. And so that's just shocking to me.
Right. And, something to keep in mind there is that when Omidyar funded that, if you go look on Democracy Fund, which is his foundation, the reason that they give for funding that is to oppose white supremacy in the U.S. So the foundational assumption there is that there was a major white supremacy problem in the U.S. So we're already buying into a premise that I think a huge number of not just evangelicals, but specifically Southern Baptists would go, wait a minute, I don't know that I agree with that. I don't know that I agree that we have a significant white supremacy problem. So even to buy into that premise on its face was something that should have been an open discussion within evangelicalism. Like we should have said, do we agree with this within the Southern Baptist Convention? Is this something that we want to participate in, an organization and an event that makes this assumption? And I think if you had asked the rank and file Southern Baptists, do you agree that we have a white supremacy problem in the U.S., the vast majority probably would have said, no, I don't agree with that. And if that is the premise for accepting this money, then I don't know that we should.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so when we think about the Southern Baptist Convention and how it's been such a strategic target for this sort of early 21st century movement by major progressive political actors to subvert and co-opt evangelicals primarily through financial resources, giving them money, getting them into the club, getting their hooks in them by supporting them with these grants, et cetera. And so we realize that that's the target. And so then when we think about what's happening in the Southern Baptist Convention, what people call a liberal drift, I've really started using different terminology proposed by Joe Rigney and also Michael Carlino, and to the idea that we've actually been steered. We're being intentionally moved in a leftward direction. And as the old adage goes, follow the money. And it takes us back to what's going on, and why we're moving this direction. For the Southern Baptist Convention listeners, could you tell me what are the three most important findings from this book that if you're in the SBC, you need to know, and primarily you should know before our annual meeting this year?
We just covered a little bit of it to some degree, but just the big umbrella item to really keep in mind is that, yes, some very powerful secular left organizations have a very strong interest in the SBC and what's happening in the SBC. So I think that's a really important thing to know. And they're writing about it and they're talking about it. So that's something to know. Second is that they are devoting money to that, to moving the SBC. And they are in contact with some of the, there's sort of a pass through. There will be so you'll have Soros money, let's say, and it will go to a pass through group like, say, Tides, the Tides Foundation, which is another large secular left foundation. And then it goes to the National Immigration Forum, which is the umbrella organization of the Evangelical Immigration Table. And so that's the other thing to know, is there's a funnel of how this happens, and it is made to conceal what's going on. They don't want you to know what's going on. And, in some of these documents, I think there was an assumption that, well, no one's really going to look at them. And then I did look at them. So it surprised me a little bit just how open they were about it. And so maybe that's the third thing, is it is really important to know that this is not a theory or a hypothesis on my part. This is absolutely what they themselves are talking about.
So, Megan, why don't you tell us sort of some of the worst of the actors? Like if you could line them all up, for to pick them out, right? Like who would be in this lineup? You've mentioned some already. Obviously, we've got George Soros, which I think people need to hear, that there is George Soros money coming into the SBC. You've mentioned Arcus, Democracy Fund, but why don't you sort of, list some specifics? Because I think maybe some of your critics, perhaps maybe some of my critics would say, oh, she's just, saying there's these people, there's these organizations, but it's all just hearsay and accusations. Well, no, that's not true. So why don't we list them out here, at least some of them, for the people to hear?
Right. So as you mentioned, Democracy Fund, which is Pierre Omidyar, the secular left Buddhist founder of eBay. George Soros, everyone knows. His is called Open Society. The Tides Foundation, which is a secular left organization that also receives a lot of money from George Soros. A lot of these people are fellow travelers. You always want to keep your eye out for the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller philanthropy. There's a number of Rockefeller foundations. There's Rockefeller Foundation. There's Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, which is who has been funding Russell Moore's After Party. There is the Hewlett Foundation, the Fetzer Institute. And so just a number of them. I mean, I could really run down the list. Another one is the Lilly Endowment, which is the foundation of the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company. And then a really big one to know about is the federal government. So I think we have to talk about the ways that some of these ministries were not necessarily Southern Baptist ministries, but the Billy Graham Center partnering with the CDC during COVID, and some of the people that SBC leaders have held up were funded by the federal government to push certain COVID policies. So we've kind of seen this sort of thing again and again, in that you're seeing people promote their friends and their influencers who are themselves grantees or receiving money or part of a foundation. So it's just a lot of funneling through of money.
So, Megan, we've talked about why the SBC was such a focus and some of the main actors behind it. And it really is just an absolutely disastrous list. I mean, why in the world would we as Southern Baptists or American Christians be wanting money from George Soros or money from the Democracy Fund? There's no such thing as free lunch, and there's no such thing as a free grant. These things come with expectations and strings attached. I'm reminded of the fact that the ERLC has also taken Facebook funding as well. And now sometimes, people could say, well, look, let's plunder the Egyptians, right? And use this money for kingdom work. But then you look at the track record and you realize that it's not that we're taking the Egyptians' money and turning around and preaching the gospel to them. It's we're taking the Egyptians' money and then turning around and passing on, Egyptian propaganda to the Christians here. But what are some of the main issues? You touched on COVID a little bit already. Obviously, the way your book breaks this down is you sort of walk through issue bucket after issue bucket with critical race theory, COVID, the LGBT agenda, which is one of the last chapters in your book, abuse reform in the SBC in particular, which we're circled back to. But when you think of the SBC, put your SBC hat on, what are the main issues these progressive funders were trying to move the SBC leftward on?
Probably one of the highest profile issues has been immigration and pushing what I would call amnesty policies, open borders policies. And the ERLC has been involved in the evangelical immigration table for years. The Southern Baptists in general have been heavily involved with the evangelical immigration table. I can tell you, when you go through and look at their leadership, you go, wow, I mean, this is just like a who's who of evangelical leaders. I mean, a number of past presidents, including J.D. Greer, again, Merritt. I honestly, at one point I went, I'm just going to stop counting SBC leaders because there's so many listed on this website. And, their defense has been, wait, we, the ERLC, don't take money from Soros, which granted, no one's saying, okay, Soros is directly giving money to the ERLC, but his foundation has given money to the EIT, which is with the Evangelical Immigration Table, which is part of the left-wing National Immigration Forum. And people don't know this. Your average rank and file don't know this. And so that has been the big foundation that I would say, or the big movement that these foundations have been targeting. And again, not just Soros, but also the Tides Foundation, the Ford Foundation. So, something like $1.3 million going to the Evangelical Immigration Table from these secular left foundations. And so when you look at that, the things that they're asking for are not, hey, let's go out and minister to the illegal immigrants in our communities and let's serve their needs. Let's, feed them, clothe them, share the gospel with them. That's not what this organization does. This organization is explicitly political, and it pushes to see policy passed. So in 2013, it was Russell Moore heavily lobbying evangelicals to push what at that time was the Gang of Eight bill. But then you saw the ERLC getting behind Senator Langford's most recent bill, which was in many ways just a retread of what we saw with the Gang of Eight bill that evangelicals and rank and file conservatives generally rejected. And, I look at an issue like that and I go, I'm fine to have disagreements as Christians on what our immigration policy should be. But that's what's been so smart, is it's getting around those policy disagreements and instead saying, what this is a Christian obligation to pass this particular legislation. And that's really sneaky. And I think it's spiritually abusive, but it's smart. And that is what we've been seeing. And so I would say that's a huge issue. They failed to some degree, but it hasn't entirely gone away on the climate change issue. That's been a very big one. One of the reports I break down in this book, one of the Soros think tanks, talked about how hard they tried to bring the SBC into this. And at that time, you had leadership, this is about 10 years ago, leadership in the ERLC who resisted. But I would say you don't have that today, and you're going to continue to see those kind of efforts be made. And you're also seeing a really big push on pluralism. And when I see this push towards pluralism, what I hear is, and you see this in their reports, if you go read these reports that the Democracy Fund, Omidyar, is funding, it is very clear that what it is calling Christians to do is to make room for leftist policy, basically saying, let's not be so stringent in arguing for our beliefs. So they're saying, instead of arguing for what we believe is right, let's argue for everyone having a seat at the table. Well, if one side is arguing for, hey, we want to see our beliefs enacted, and the other side is arguing for, we want to see everyone have a seat at the table, which side do you think is going to win? So it makes a lot of sense that this is the particular tactic that they're pushing within the ERLC in these particular reports that they're writing and issuing.
Okay, so immigration and pluralism, and those really kind of go hand in hand because, open borders, globalism goes hand in hand with pluralism, downplaying strong national loyalties. And of course, they mask a lot of it in Christianese about, loving your neighbor, welcoming the stranger, the parable of the Good Samaritan. All of that is sort of the theological justification that they use for some of this. And as somebody who worked in Washington, D.C., I saw it myself. I saw the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission take what I thought was often the wrong side on any issue pertaining to immigration. Also fascinating, Megan, I was working in Washington, D.C. in the run up to and the aftermath of Obergefell. And in the immediate aftermath of Obergefell, Senator Lee and another House member had a bill called the First Amendment Defense Act, which very short bill just sought to restrict the federal government from discriminating against any, organization, whether Christian or otherwise, that continued to believe that marriage would be between a man and a woman. So you can't deny him federal grants, things like that. And I worked at Heritage Action. I was sort of the lead lobbyist for it. And the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission was, part of the coalition that was supposedly trying to help pass this bill. And my counterpart at the ERLC on this issue was a guy by the name of Stephen Harris. And again and again in these coalition meetings, I found the ERLC's participation and effort on what you would have thought would have been such a main priority for them, lackluster at best. Later, Stephen Harris left the ERLC to go work on the Biden campaign. And so that's just sort of the insight of how, I found the ERLC to be operating during Russell Moore's tenure. Obviously, I talked to John Whitehead on the Center for Baptist Leadership podcast about that and what happened there. But this gives us some more background into what's happening. Another issue, Megan, that's central in your book and is something that you've engaged upon and really, I'd say boldly in the public debate, is on the issue of the so-called abuse crisis in the Southern Baptist Convention or in American Christianity. And you have been willing to go against the grain and against the prevailing narrative in pursuit of the truth. And this has a whole chapter in your book, a chapter where we see figures like Russell Moore, David Prince, Philip Bethencourt, Rachel Denhollander, all four Southern Baptists that I just named, and the abuse crisis. You've run down particular cases between individuals, trying to make sure that both sides of the story get told. So why don't you walk us through what your reporting revealed to you in terms of this so-called abuse crisis in the SBC and what's really going on here?
Abuse has been such a hot button issue that I would say it was when I really started paying attention to what was happening in the SBC at a national level. Maybe the CRT stuff a little bit, but for me, it was really when the abuse stuff was first taking root that some scales kind of fell away from my eyes. And I went, wait a minute, as a reporter, what's happening here? It was, 3 years ago when these alleged victims were being drug up to the podiums in these very grandstanding, emotional, media manipulation kind of ways that I went, something is not right here. This does not pass the smell test. And that was when I really started paying attention and digging in. And as it went on and the report came out, I could not make sense of the rhetoric that was in the mainstream legacy media with the reality of what was in the report and what the real numbers showed. So, the first thing I did was break down the numbers, because the reality was nothing there gave support to words like apocalypse or crisis, or really anything that we were seeing there. And I could make no sense of that. And your interview with John Whitehead was really illuminating, though. As I was watching it, I went, yes, this is everything I knew that was going on. And a lot of it that I wrote about, though I went into much more specific cases. So when the report came out and I went, these numbers don't make sense, especially if you're going to call something a crisis. It is very odd that I could find no evidence of any sort of cover up, that they were saying, well, the executive committee covered this up and covered that up. And as I was looking at it, I went, nothing here has been covered up. That there's been a false narrative from start to finish about things like a secret list of abusers. Well, then you come to find out, well, no, they just, someone on the staff started up a list from Google alerts of people related in some way to the SBC who had either been arrested or charged or convicted. So news reports, essentially newspaper clippings via Google alert, and made a list out of it. Well, in no reasonable sense is that a cover up. That was bizarre. And you saw that splashed all over the media. You saw it trumpeted by well-known figures like David French, like Russell Moore. And so as I dug into it, it became very clear that people were using this either as a way to target enemies, to move the SBC in a more egalitarian direction, or because they themselves were using it to advance their own platforms. And I think you saw that with a lot of people, and that doesn't get talked about that much. But there are some people that I go, I think that's a reasonably smart guy. And I have a hard time believing that he did not know that he was overselling this.
On that one.
I mean, I'll tell you that I have reached out to people like Grant Gaines. I watch Dean and Sarah. I watch some of these people and I go, I don't understand what you're doing right here, because I think you're smarter than what I'm seeing you say in the public sphere, in front of the podium, when you're chattering on social media. Todd Banker, obviously another huge one, who really thought he was going to make his name on abuse. It seemed very obvious to me that that's what was happening. So in the book, I dove into some specific cases, because when the Guidepost report came out, there were two major cases that were really explored in it and that really made the headlines. Neither one of them were clear cut. Neither one of them involved children like you would have expected. You would have expected, this is terrible, children have been abused. Neither of the major cases in that report fit that bill. So that was very bizarre to me. And as I started digging into it, and I'll let people read it, it's very thorny and long to go into here. But essentially what I found was two adult women who much later said, I was abused after what the man in each case, Johnny Hunt and Professor David Sills, said were consensual acts. And in many of these cases, it wasn't even clear what the acts were. So as you went down the rabbit trail, in particular, the Jennifer Lyle, David Sills case, which was the most prominent case in the Guidepost report, there were so many odd details there. Like I found someone asking Rachel Den Hollander, it seemed like real sincerity, what was the abuse? What does Jennifer Lyle allege that David Sills did to her? And Rachel Den Hollander popped up in response to this question that was not to her and said, I am Ms. Lyle's attorney, and I can tell you that this has always been judged to be criminal assault. Well, in fact, Jennifer Sills had never filed a police report, had never filed any charges. David Sills had never been investigated, let alone been brought before a court or a jury. So the idea that anyone would have judged this criminal assault was flat out false, because it had never even been charged. So these were the kind of things that I found really weird. Like, why are we being told we can't ask questions on the one hand about these cases, but on the other hand, we have to make major sweeping reforms to how the SBC does its business when it comes to abuse? That was very strange to me. And that's when I started looking at, okay, what are the real reasons that this is going on? And then the other element of this was, I believe that she is driven by the right motivations, but anyone who does not get a check or a balance on their judgment is going to become myopic and unbalanced. And I think that's what we've seen with Rachel Den Hollander, in the sense that she was now Jennifer Lyle's attorney. She advised Southern Seminary, where this alleged abuse took place, on how to handle Jennifer Lyle's accusations.
That sounds like a conflict of interest.
And it goes on. I mean, I'm just getting started.
Okay, keep going.
So she advised Southern Seminary how to handle the Lyle case. She then represented Lyle as her attorney. She then recommended Guidepost to do the investigation. She was then the lead advisor to the task force as the Guidepost investigation was going on. She was then appointed at the same time that she's advising the task force as the caller advocate. And then leaks came out in which she said she was connecting callers to the SBC abuse hotline to potential legal representation. Huge issues here. I mean, there should be massive ethical questions, and nobody was asking them. And in any sensible organization, those questions would be asked. And that doesn't begin to get to the questions of why were these demands from Rachel, pushed by Rachel, in which she helped draft these demands to waive attorney-client privilege. So it was really bizarre to me that you had one individual who was so connected with all parties and all parts of this, and nobody stood back and said, hey, you know what? Maybe this is not ethically a good idea. Maybe it's just common sense, not a good idea. And so that was really where my reporting was grounded, was again and again, I ran into issues like that. And, it's hard because I think there are sincere people who want to see abuse addressed. I absolutely know that. And abuse is terrible. And everywhere that it occurs, we should absolutely report it. And we should hold people responsible for it. And certainly if they cover it up and they commit it, hold them responsible. But we have a legal system for that. We do not need a separate parallel organization running apart from the legal system that does not offer the same due process protections. And that's what a lot of people were pushing. And that's when I started to have questions.
Megan, that was fascinating, particularly how succinctly you connected the dots with Rachel Denhollander's undue influence behind the scenes in the SBC, her conflicts of interest, and her own agenda. Now, thankfully, I think that this is something that is beginning to be acceptable to talk about. I mean, you've been talking about it, obviously, in the time period where it's not been acceptable. I've ventured out into the foray as well and suggested that Rachel has undue influence and perhaps her own agenda. But, Willie Rice, it was fascinating when I had Willie Rice on the podcast, and he said that when he was running for SBC president, there were two names that he was told he couldn't cross, and Rachel Denhollander was one of them. And the way that he realized that whole abuse reform effort had, as he said, a lot more in it. He said the SBC got Brett Kavanaugh, and for the same reasons too. Now, in your book, a lot of this is tied to money. What's the connection here on this abuse side? Did you find any evidence of grants or funding that was sort of influencing this process? Or was this really a case of the SBC and our leaders getting caught up in a larger agenda, like the Me Too movement?
I would say it's pretty much the second part. I didn't find any funding on this particular topic. And so I don't want to give the impression that every bit of sort of left-wing drift that you might see is connected to, dark money. Plenty is. So we don't need to overplay the hand there. Sure. But you also have, we are told that people who, do not commit themselves to sound scripture and study are going to drift. And I think we have seen drift. And it's a very natural thing when people are being lauded in the media, when they are receiving Plum fellowships, when they are receiving Plum invitations to all sorts of Tony political events and things of that nature, that your head gets turned. And you want the applause, and you want to have an appeal with the culture. And I think that's a big part of what we've been seeing. And with the abuse issue, that's why I go, it is the longest chapter in my book, because there were so many different motivations to peel off there. Again, there were people who, I think were misguided. But I also think, I think that someone like Russell Moore was incredibly successful at orchestrating this to take down enemies. And your interview with John Whitehead, as I said, just did a tremendous job revealing what I already knew, but what I don't think a lot of other people knew, which was, sure. That this was just so political from start to finish for someone like him. I mean, to the point where everyone forgot after he said that this poor victim, Jennifer Lyle, had been torn apart, and Rachel Denhollander said, they just left her in the lurch, and everyone was accusing the executive committee of having treated her very badly. And then the report comes out. You kind of forgot, I guess, most of the world to go look at what the actual receipts showed that these members of the executive committee said about Jennifer Lyle. And it was very reasonable, kind things. I mean, even as they were being publicly attacked, they were saying things like, I want her to be whole, but this is not the way to get that. And and at no point did they question whether she was telling the truth. They were just saying, gosh, I don't know that we should run this, because do we know for certain that she was abused? Has this man admitted to it? How old was she at the time? A very reasonable question. And once again, they make the point, no one had even said what the abuse was. So it was very reasonable, the questions and the comments that the executive committee was making. So I would say someone like Russell Moore was just incredibly effective at using the most hyperbolic rhetoric and making that the headline so that you had none of the media asking, well, hold on a minute. What did this executive committee actually do to this woman? And is this really the major case that on which we are saying there's an abuse apocalypse and that the SBC is a diseased orchard, as David French said? So, really, that was to me what was driving it way more than money. But from that, I will say Russell Moore certainly got a lot of benefit out of it. I mean, book deals himself, fellowships, lots of invitations on MSNBC, all of that kind of thing. So, just because someone's not making you a grantee of their foundation doesn't mean there's not financial benefit.
Sure, that's right. And when you pull the camera back, you see that the main figures in the Southern Baptist Convention that were either working with Rachel or using her or being used by her, whichever way that was going, were some of these main characters. Again, Russell Moore from the ERLC getting leftist money documented, and a good amount of it during his tenure. J.D. Greer. Actually, let's talk about J.D. Greer for a second. You said J.D. Greer comes up in your book fairly regularly. I've got a hypothesis, Megan. We can try it on here in this interview. I think J.D. Greer has been running the SBC for the last 6 to 8 years, more or less, because when you think about what happened, J.D. Greer was he was running against Steve Gaines, and Gaines it was so close, and then Gaines dropped out. No. J.D. Greer dropped out and was like, okay, Gaines, you take it. And then Gaines is like, I'll endorse J.D., when it's his turn. And so really at that point, J.D. starts running the SBC. And then we get J.D. for 3 years. Then we get Litton, who was essentially just like J.D. for 1 year. And then we get Bart Barber for 2. But really behind the scenes here, a guy you can't get away from in the liberal drift of the SBC is J.D. Greer. He's right there in the mix on the abuse. The way they handled the abuse things, the way Russell Moore set things up during his departure. What did you find in your book about J.D. Greer?
I mean, essentially, a lot of what you just outlined there is, I tried to withhold my judgment on why he's doing it. But what I certainly found is I could not get away from J.D. Greer as I was writing the book. So whatever the issue was, something like CRT, he was a very strong proponent of racial hiring quotas within the SBC. He talked about his ability to transform the institutions by hiring, I think it was something like he said all his hires were going to be 20% minorities or women. We saw him heavily pushing Black senior pastors on churches that voted them down, and then calling that church, this particular church, racist with no evidence, when some of the people did not want to vote for this particular candidate because he wasn't qualified. So for those who aren't familiar with that story, I go into deep detail on First Baptist Naples, which is a church that there was no evidence that they were motivated by race, but about 20% of their members did not want to vote for the Black senior pastor that appeared to be handpicked by J.D. Greer. And Greer at that point, and Danny Aiken. A lot of stuff comes out of Raleigh and the Raleigh area. Let me just say that. Directly called them racist publicly, but never detailed. So what was funny is there was all of this talk about.
Barber did too, actually.
Yes, Bart Barber did too. So Aiken did, Greer did, Bart Barber did. I feel like there was a couple others that escaped me that I detailed specifically what they said. But the point is there was this effort to transform the SBC so that it would no longer be a place, according to Greer, where neo-Confederates and white supremacists were comfortable sitting in our pews, which is such an explosive claim to make. And again, those headlines are run, but at no point did any media figure ask J.D. Greer, what is your evidence of the neo-Confederates? Because for a claim like that, it should be specific. Neo-Confederate means something. White supremacist means something. And at the same time, you saw him using the very language of CRT when he was using the Aspen Institute's glossary. He read it in a social media clip that started making the rounds in this interview where he's talking about, well, here's what systemic racism is. And so he's using the same document that is being used on the campus of Harvard and other left-wing universities to say that we have a systemic racism problem. So, he was very influential in that. Certainly on the immigration issue with the ERLC, with the EIT abuse, I just really kept finding him again and again. And now here he is again on this question of women pastors. And so at a certain point, you have to go, everything that is opening the door to a certain acceptable form of progressivism in the church, you are so often bound up with. Why? Why is that the case? And, to be honest with you, only J.D. Greer can answer that. But I know that that is the case, that I was shocked at how often he turned up and how often I found his name, and really how often he was extremely accusatory and uncharitable to people without evidence behind that very winsome smile.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's fascinating. These characters that you're examining in your book, and again, why do I want Southern Baptists to listen to this before Indianapolis? And I'll try to give a little bit of a summary here, and then get your engagement, and then maybe we can pivot to a couple practical pieces of advice. I want you to give SBC pastors some practical advice. But the summary I would say is, like, when we say Shepherds for Sale is so important for Southern Baptists to read in general, and we lament the fact that it's not out before this convention, is because it really pulls the camera back and then also shows in detail how there has been an intentional infiltration and subversion of America's largest Protestant Christian conservative denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, to move us leftward, whether through money on political issues, immigration, climate change, etc., or if there's not money involved, we get a look at how some of our leading figures were sort of captured by the spirit of the age. Like everything you just covered on the abuse issue, it's not so much that there was necessarily money involved getting our SBC leaders to adopt a Me Too posture, but it was the world is watching that caused them to lead us in a certain way and work with individuals. And now, as we move into Indianapolis here, we've got a chance to vote for change. We have an open presidential election. We have options available to us. Jared Moore, David Allen, men who are independent from this platform, who have held the line on these issues. And so we have a chance to go in a different direction. We have a chance to pass the law amendment and shut the door on egalitarianism, which is connected to so many other things. And this might sound hard, but what we need SBC messengers to know is that they really shouldn't trust a lot of the SBC leadership that we've seen over the last decade. That's how I would put it, Megan. But you know what? You're coming to Indianapolis and you're speaking at the Center for Baptist Leadership and Founders Ministries lunch event on Tuesday, June 11th. We're so excited to have you. How would you put it? Why is this material so important for Southern Baptists as we're heading up to our convention here within the week?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, I think it's important to understand how the SBC is being moved and how this mechanism works. One of the things you see is that a general statement in a resolution will be put forward. Everyone hears it. It will be a general statement of, we think that we should be kind to immigrants, that we should have a reasonable, lawful immigration process, something that anyone would sign their name to. You hear it, I hear it, you go, that makes sense. I could agree with that. On the recommendation of the platform, everyone passes it. Those resolutions are then used by the ERLC to lobby for policies that not everyone would agree with. In fact, I would say maybe the majority of Southern Baptists, given that it's a very conservative convention, and we know that the conservative base does not like this policy, something like Langford's bill, that's how it's used. And so I think that's one thing to know, is that people very well-meaning don't understand how this game is being played. And so I think you really need to know that. You need to dig in. You need to look behind the quick Baptist press explainers and press releases, because a lot of times, I'm going to be blunt, they're not telling the truth. I can give you the example of the Baptist press explainer from 2020 that said, no. The EIT has never taken a penny from George Soros. Well, George Soros's own documents show that that is not true, that it has taken money, and that it names Southern Baptists, not evangelicals, not conservative evangelicals. His own documents name Southern Baptists. So that is a big thing I want them to know, is how this process is being used. And I think a really good way to start would be with financial transparency. It is insane to me that an organization managing such huge funds that come from tithes does not have the same financial transparency that you would expect and that you get from any secular NGO. I mean, that's really kind of mind-boggling. So I think we need that transparency. I think you have to understand how this process is being used, because in a lot of ways, then your voice, your messenger vote, your tithe money, it's going to things that you wouldn't agree with. You might not like gun control. The ERLC has, Brent Leatherwood in particular, has used resources at the ERLC to push gun control in Tennessee. Whatever the issue is, I think we have to get back to first principles and ask, what are the things that Southern Baptists as a large association care about? Because we don't have to be involved in every political fight. And I think that is the big message to me. Maybe we don't have to take a position on whatever the latest immigration bill is. We as Christians can disagree on that. We don't have to take a position as a convention on this gun control bill. What we could do is just look at those issues that the Bible is crystal clear on and speak to that. So I would love to see more effort to go, hey, I mean, if you want to call it the essentials as far as political issues, because they're also biblical issues, let's get back to those essentials. And then, something on the abuse issue, and I went into this in detail in my book, because so much of this issue was predicated not on child abuse, where it's very clear, but on these very murky allegations between adults. What astonished me was how they created such a different definition of sin for women than what the Bible does. And, as somebody who has both experienced sexual assault, but also came to Christ as a sexual sinner, I was really devastated to see how they were trying to build their own platforms, but sacrificing women's consciences by doing it, by creating these new power differential definitions of what abuse was. Because when you do that, you leave women burdened. You may be telling them, you did nothing wrong, but you don't know that if you're talking about adults. You don't know what level of will or agency was involved. So, that's another thing is on all of these issues, I want you to think about, as you're making yourself look good, what are you doing to the person who may be burdened with sin? What are you doing to the person who may be impacted by whatever this policy is? And would it be better for you to say nothing and think a little bit more deeply about the issue before you run out to that camera at CNN or wherever it may be, the Washington Post, to get your soundbite, to get your name out there and to get people applauding you as some Southern Baptist leader? So, I mean, that was kind of a long-winded answer, but that is something that I have felt so passionately about, that I am really bothered by the lack of shepherding that I see. So I want to get back to essentials, both on shepherding and essentials on what are the issues that we should be speaking out about. And maybe we can just not talk at all about the rest.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. That was very well said. And I think that gets sort of to the theological heart of these issues, is that the Southern Baptist Convention and again, other actors and areas of in American evangelicalism over the past decade, we've been increasingly pressured to not call sins what the Bible calls very clear sins, whether that's on, homosexual activity and behavior, whether that's on, pronoun hospitality, or other things like that, LGBT issues, and then also sexual sin. And then we've been pressured to call things sin that are not so clearly sin, right? Like we're all told to denounce white supremacy, but then we look around and we're wondering, well, where are all these white supremacists that are supposedly in our rank? Because actually we're seeing some sinful ethnic partiality on the other side of things, perpetrated against white people, as we call them all racist. And so getting back to a biblical understanding of sin is so important, because that's where the gospel meets us. And that's where the gospel frees us. And that's where we find forgiveness in Christ, is not for made up sins, and certainly not if we can't repent of things that truly are sins, but when we own our sin before the Lord. And I think, it's really interesting. Willie Rice, again, on my interview with him, he said that we need to recognize that people like Alyssa Milano, is that her name? One of the Harvey Weinstein characters. He was like, Alyssa Milano was abused by Harvey, and that's terrible, and that makes her a victim. But she also goes out there and she preaches in defense of abortion, and that makes her a horrible perpetrator of injustice too. And we need to recognize that, and recognize that even women can do that too. And so I think that's so important. Also, just so fascinating, Megan, I've not really thought through how the the original Houston Chronicles report painted this picture of an apocalypse of child sexual abuse that's happening in the Southern Baptist Convention. But you're absolutely right. The guidepost investigations and reports and everything else, and even primarily these lawsuits, are centering around sort of grown adult consensual behavior that later got turned into an abuse claim. And it's just so fascinating. I've not heard somebody spell that out so clearly as you did just now. And I think that's important for Southern Baptists to recognize.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say possibly consensual. I don't know,
Sure.
but certainly consensual is a possibility as far as an explanation. And you've got two people, and one is saying it was consensual and never been investigated. Charges have never been filed. In the case of Johnny Hunt, you've got the woman specifically admitting, I didn't see this as abuse until I went through special trauma training. And then I came to realize 10 years later, when, my husband and I went through trauma training, then we realized it was abuse. I didn't know, even though she was an adult married woman with children in her mid 30s, couldn't identify it as abuse at that point. I mean, that should raise questions. And the thing that really bothers me, sort of belabor the abuse question, is this idea that, people will go, yeah, but Johnny Hunt's disqualified. It doesn't matter. He's disqualified. Okay. It's fine to say he's disqualified. You can say that if there was any sexual sin, then he's disqualified. The question is, because you can say he's disqualified, does that make it okay to say he's guilty of abuse? Because these are two different issues, and conflating them actually means something to women. If it's abuse, then a woman has not sinned. If she couldn't help it, if she was assaulted, if she was abused, she has then not participated in sin herself. So that's why I get back to how you define these things actually matters as to how you are shepherding women.
Yeah, that's very well said. And so, Megan, we've covered a lot of ground here. And the abuse reform issue is still up for debate in the Southern Baptist Convention. When we launched Center for Baptist Leadership, you know me, I'm not one to shy away from taking things head on. I wanted our first article out the gate to be on the abuse reform issue. I still think it's one of the best things we published, by John Whitehead and Josh Abatoy, arguing for a better path forward on abuse response in the SBC, calling for Baptistic accountability, saying that it needs to be handled at the local church level. We need to do things to prevent abuse, spot abuse, and respond to abuse. And a lot of that has to be worked through local law enforcement, but also using organizations like Ministry Safe. Again, so fascinating when really Rice got into the fact how the abuse survivor community doesn't like Ministry Safe because it's too focused on preventing abuse, and they claim not enough on the survivors. But and then at the convention level, really all we can do is we can hold churches accountable if they harbor abusers, right? And we can disfellowship them, but we can't build these, extrajudicial investigative bodies. We can't put these databases together. We can't keep people on lists if they're, just credibly accused. And so they essentially argue for winding down the ARITF, for not launching this new abuse response commission. Willie Rice makes the same argument. So I think it's important for our listeners to hear your backstory here, which just shines additional light on the other agendas and actors in this as we go into this convention and we're asked, what do we do moving forward on abuse? And we have to recognize this whole thing got off on a bad foot from early on. So thank you for that on the abuse issues, on the political issues, holding the ERLC accountable. That's so important. But Megan, I think actually one thing that would be particularly helpful for Southern Baptist pastors is what are maybe some tips or tools that you could give them on how to do some of this research themselves? Obviously, you can't give it all away for free because then you'd be out of a job. But, we want more Baptist pastors doing the work to hold our entities accountable. You voiced your support for the 990 amendment that Rep Burns is offering on financial transparency. That's so important because if we had that, we could see some of these things. But why don't you give your average Southern Baptist pastor and lay member maybe some tips and tricks on how to follow the money themselves?
I mean, a big one is there's a site that anyone can use called ProPublica, and you can go and look up the money flows for, any organization that is a nonprofit. They have to post these things. So you won't see who's receiving the money, or you won't see, let's say you look up the ERLC. You wouldn't be able to see the ERLC saying, here's everyone we got money from. But the Democracy Fund does have to say, here's who we gave money to. So you can go look up the Democracy Fund and see, did they give money to the ERLC? Oh, I see they did. It was for this report. What was this report? Who funded it? So, that would be a first step. When you see these reports coming from the ERLC or some other entity, even just go to the bottom. Sometimes it just says there at the bottom, here's who funded this thing. So it's not like this is secret information and I had to really, dig hard to find it. It really, that kind of thing is not hard to find. So I would really encourage people, know this kind of thing. And when you see that these foundations are funding it, ask why. What is their interest here with us? And then the other thing, listen, I know we've all got buddies, we've all got friends, all our friends want us to sign on to some policy prescription or some statement. If you don't know how it's going to be used, ask a lot of questions about, okay, how is this going to be used? What will this mean if I throw my support either with a signature or voicing my support or voting for it as a messenger? What's it going to mean after that? Is this thing going to be used as some sort of cover to do other things I might not agree with? Well, then you should know that. And that's a question that should be asked. So always ask your friends that. If you're familiar with Eric Metaxas, the Bonhoeffer biographer and well-known radio host, he has openly talked about, hey, I got caught in that EIT thing myself. They put out a general statement. It sounded great. I signed it. And then he came to find out about the Soros background and took his name off of it. So when that happens, also be willing to go, hey, you know what? I made a mistake. I'm actually not on board with that. Remove your name, make the statement, say, I'm not okay with that. I did not sign up to participate in this. And I would love to see the whole convention do that. So, and just ask a lot of questions and Google is your friend. I'm not, or maybe we should say DuckDuckGo or Brave browser, but whatever it is, just look into the background and ask some questions, because I really think that, not acting until you know exactly what you're acting upon is the better part of valor here.
Yeah. I mean, so those are some very helpful practical tips. Maybe just one last question here before we get into starting to wrap this up. What about the mindset, right? Like you have a mindset that you use to approach your work, and you try not to jump to conclusions. You want to ask, is there more here? And really, again, so much of what you detail in your book and what you and I have just witnessed in the SBC is just this rush to adopt a narrative. And then it gets sort of baked in. And then anybody who wants to question the narrative is the bad guy, and so how do you cultivate that mindset that wants the truth and is not prone to getting caught by the narrative?
It's funny. My friend Molly Hemingway always does this thing whenever she's being the contrary person on a political panel on some issue. Hang on a minute. And I feel like I've learned to approach my work with hang on a minute. Is there another explanation for this? Or is there another reasonable point of view? Because I think everybody's tendency is to go, that's the respectable point of view. I better get on this, right side of it, especially if it's something very emotionally loaded like abuse or immigrants who need help. The initial reaction is always, I better get on the compassionate side without going, well, hang on a minute. What's the ask here? Are there other explanations for the stories that are being told? So, that's a big part of what I do is go, well, now wait. And also, look, if the entire secular world is rushing to one side of the boat, I always kind of want to go, why? Why are you, why do I want to join what I know people who oppose God are rushing to champion? Like, you take something like climate change and fossil fuel legislation. I'm willing to have an open discussion about that. But if, every major corporation, every world leader, every secular foundation are all pushing this particular issue and this particular legislation, I'm going to hang back for a minute and go, let me think this through. I don't immediately want to join hands with whatever ideology is motivating them to do that. And I certainly don't want to take that ideology and come up with some sort of tortured Christianese to justify why I'm involved with that. And I definitely don't want to water down the force of the gospel with whatever this worldly agenda is. In the book, I make a joke that one of the climate change activists who Danny Akin welcomed to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary to sell carbon credits to the students. He said, one of the things I recommend, because climate change is a gospel issue, because of course everything that's a left-wing priority is now a gospel issue.
Everything that's a left-wing priority is a gospel issue, but all the things that we conservatives care about, we're just being too political.
You're grasping for power, right?
That's right.
So, he was saying one thing you should do is buy carbon credits if you're going to fly, which, was insane to me that this thing happened at a Southern Baptist seminary. And I'm going to assume the speaker was paid by Southern Baptist tithe dollars. He said that the reason we have to join up with this climate change movement is to have a distinctly Christian witness. And as I was watching the video, I might have, spit out my drink a little bit at that point, because to me, I said, it's like the old Eddie Murphy joke, if anyone remembers this, about Johnny Carson's wife getting a job at a boutique because she wanted to do her part. So it was like, I got $70 million and now here's my $70. Now Johnny Carson has $70 million and $70. That's what a distinctly Christian witness supposedly is in this scenario. Every corporation, every major film studio, the entertainment industry, all the leaders. But no, we need to join up too to show how distinctly Christian we are. So if that is the sell, if the sell is we're going to show how Christian we are by joining up with the world, maybe hang back for a minute and ask how much sense that makes.
Well said. And so hang on a minute, just ask, wait a second here. Where are we being steered? Where are we being led? I mean, there's so much more that we could talk about in your book, and hopefully we'll have you back on when it comes out. When is it releasing? When is it available?
July 30th. So officially out July 30th.
Okay, July 30th, but you can pre-order it right now on Amazon. It's Shepherd's First Sale. What's the subtitle again?
How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda.
How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. Make sure you go and pre-order it. And if you're going to be in Indianapolis, please join us on June 11th for lunch with Megan and others at the Center for Baptist Leadership and Founders Ministry lunch event. And Megan, people who come are going to be able to get access to an excerpt from your book. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. So we need to figure out the mechanism for that. But yes, I need to go right now, in fact, and go pick out the selection that I'm going to go with. So.
That's great. And, one of the things that I love about Megan's book is I love the quotes you have at the start of the chapters. You've got great, chapter quotes there. And really in the intro, I mean, you've got a lot of good ones, but I think this one really kind of summarizes so much of what the thesis of your book. And it's from Joy Davidman. And she says, the second part, she says, but mustn't the churches adapt Christianity to suit the ideas of our time? No, they must not. Our ideas are killing us spiritually. When your child swallows poison, you don't sit around thinking of ways to adapt his constitution to a poisonous diet. You give him an emetic. You purge the poison. And really what you detail in this book and what's so important for so many people to realize is whether it's for money, whether it's for influence, whether it's because we're embarrassed by something or our leaders have been embarrassed by something in the gospel of Jesus Christ in a secular world, we've allowed so much of leftist poison to infiltrate American evangelicalism and even the Southern Baptist Convention. But with Megan's expose here, it doesn't have to be the end of the story. So Megan, thank you so much for your time joining us today. Where can people find you, follow you, and learn more about your work?
I'm on Twitter, or X as it's known now, at Meg Basham. I spend way too much time there. I'm working on that. And I'm on Instagram at journalist Megan Basham. And you can find me every week, number of times a week, at Morning Wire Podcast. So if you don't get our great Morning Wire podcast, it's just news, 15 minutes in and out, 3 top stories. I am often one of the reporters on one of those stories, and always at the Daily Wire.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Megan. And people can pre-order your book on Amazon, anywhere else, HarperCollins too, or just on Amazon?
I mean, everywhere that you should be able to order it, at Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can go straight to HarperCollins website and get it, and they give you kind of a list of options.
Great. Folks, I want to say this too. You need to pre-order this book. And here's why. There's been so many garbage books written about Christians and politics from a leftist side of things. They've written the same book 10 times, The Kingdom and the Power and the Glory by Tim Alberta, Jesus and John Wayne, Taking America Back for God, and so on and so forth, all accusing Christians of selling out to the right. When what Megan shows is the reality is we have really sold out to the left for a few dollars and a seat at the table. It's truly a breath of fresh air. It contradicts the narrative. I hope it leaves all these books in the dust. And so let me encourage you to pre-order it and get a copy. Is that fair, Megan? Sort of.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Counterpunch to all these same books that have been written before.
It is absolutely that. And I have joked that, they bring subjective stories and vibes. I'm bringing hard receipts.
That's right. That's right. Well, again, Megan, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to having you in Indianapolis.
Thanks for having me.
The Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.